Hi everyone, it's Amy, and I'm actually here on Facebook Live to discuss the idea of grading academic papers with confidence. Someone did jump on Zoom, but I tried saying hi, and then it was an Anne. So Anne, if you were on there, I did see you. I'm sorry if you didn't hear me. I know sometimes the first part of Zoom can kind of be frustrating, or it may have been someone from my dance group. I'm not sure. So I wanted to go ahead and get in here, and because I'm doing this on Facebook Live, I don't have the screen sharing option. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll download this, but I'm going to actually send you an email, a follow-up email with this in there. And I'm going to, instead of just screen sharing, I'm going to actually send you the rubrics and the various things that I do, which are probably going to be more practical and more useful for you than just me talking things through. So when we're talking about grading academic papers with confidence, a lot of the times people who aren't, well, maybe even if you are English people, but if you are homeschooling, but you didn't really go, like let's say that you studied engineering or you studied something else in college, and you didn't stick with something where you were writing a lot of English style academic papers, then when you get to this part, you may feel really uncomfortable doing it. And part of it is probably from high school, and you probably felt, or even the first year of college, and you probably felt really frustrated, as if what you were doing didn't really matter, but you just had to do it. Maybe you weren't fully instructed in what was expected. So you've lived life, you've done all these things, but as soon as you get to this part of grading, you start to feel really as if you don't have any confidence. And I want to take that away from you. And I'm going to even have like some graphics and things that I'll be sharing with you. But there's three things that I want to emphasize when you're looking at teaching writing academic papers. So that's probably more where you're frustrated. It's one thing to grade things because you can tell what's right and wrong, but it's another to teach it. And if you haven't done that before and it's not your strong point, then you might feel frustrated. So the three things that I really want to look at are structure, content, and grammar. Structure and content go hand in hand, so maybe content, structure, and grammar. And I'm looking specifically at literary analysis papers and not just any academic paper. Now again, this fits, but literary analysis papers tend to be where people get really stymied because you're probably strong with book reports, you're probably strong with research papers, because to an extent, they have to be structured, but you're just recycling information, making it better, hopefully drawing conclusions and not just telling what happened. But we're looking at literary analysis papers. You're having to hopefully not do as much research. Look, I tend to be a close reader, so looking at the poem itself and or the story or the novel itself and drawing my content from there. So, and not going beyond that at first, because I really think if you do this correctly, unless you just have something that's like older and so you don't know what the words mean, or you're not sure about the social mores of the time and you're having to read up on why certain things were done certain ways, then you should be able to really approach the novel, the thing itself, and be able to draw conclusions from that just based on the ability to read. And I'd encourage you to do that. Of course, history, all of those things are super important, but if you're learning that in your history classes or at the beginning of each novel, or however you're doing your units, where if you do some sort of historical context reading or discussion, then that should set the stage for really understanding whatever it is you're reading. So when we're looking at writing these academic papers, the first thing you want to know is what the content is. So I should have probably put it that way. So content, I'm going to put that in the comments as well. It's going to be content, structure, and grammar. And grammar is going to encompass a lot of things. So with that, when we're looking at content for a literary analysis paper, it tends to be what is happening and why? Or what is happening and how? Or why is something happening and how is the author doing it? So when you are looking at your content, it is not a book report. And that's the biggest thing that I want you to look at. When you are teaching these analysis papers and when you are grading, one of the biggest things that you have to look at is this merely telling me what is going on, book report, or has it moved into the realm of analysis, telling me what is going on, why it's important, what it's going on, and how the author is structuring what's going on. And a lot of times, especially with my younger students, but even with older ones, the content tends to be, what is the author's theme, and how is the author getting his theme across? I do that because, one, theme is what is the author saying about a subject, a topic, right? So if the topic is love, what is the author saying about love? So it's not just the author talks about love, or the author talks about the theme of this book is love. It's a thematic element, perhaps, that is a topic, but it's what the author is saying about love. What's his worldview? For those of you who do a lot with worldview, you're more concerned with that and not just with the topic. Now, you can always say, well, the author treats the topic in this way, but that's really just kind of a roundabout way of saying, here's his theme. So a lot of time with content, you need to be able to thoroughly paraphrase, summarize, explain, tell the content of the book. But that's not what your analysis paper is only about. It's theme, it's character development, not just the characters, but how they develop, how the characters show some sort of theme. And even when you're dealing with conflict, like a lot of times you'll get, there are 3 conflicts in this book. But what's the so what? Your content needs to be focusing on the so what. They're developing to show. They develop in opposite ways, which explains how the author is setting you up to think that life is basically bad, basically good, optimistic, pessimistic, whatever it is you make of it, that sort of thing. Now, again, part of the reason that this content part frustrates you and frustrates your student is, as far as I know, up until about the 6th grade, maybe even in 7th and 8th, you're doing book reports because you're focused on reading comprehension. Because if you don't have that reading comprehension and you don't have that ability to explain just what's happening, then you can't analyze it. And so you're going to have students who are like, oh, I don't really know what's happening, so I'm going to go read SparkNotes. And SparkNotes tells me the analysis, and then they can't really even differentiate between elements, like what's happening, and the analysis because they're used to SparkNotes or you or someone else telling them. So number 1 with the content is knowing what's going on. And that's just a matter of, if you're trying to figure out what's going on, keeping notes, and looking up words in the dictionary. That's primarily the matter. And there can be really awful authors that you're forced to read because they're important. And there are, like James Fenimore Cooper is the worst. Like, I have no idea what happens in The Last of the Mohicans. And I've read that book and taught it under duress so many times. It's the worst book. But you can kind of figure out what's going on. Hey, Debbie. And you can start to put that content together. Now, I never make students write literary analysis papers over The Last of the Mohicans because it's so badly done. I do have them look at other pictures now. I might have them look at how Fenimore Cooper deals with prejudice. I might have them argue. He's just said it's just a badly written book that I tend to stay away from anything because he'll be unintentionally racist, unintentionally demeaning. Like, you can tell he really wants to promote treating people well, but just the way he writes doesn't work really that well. So in general, you want your content to be what's going on and why is that important. So that's, again, one of the reasons why I highly recommend that if you do have a book list for your students, and this is even seniors, that you read as much of the books as you can, because one of the best ways of getting to the analysis of your content is just having an actual discussion. Because if they can verbalize what happened and why it matters, they can write that down. And in fact, one of the ways that I have my students actually start their any kind of analysis is through speech. I do public speaking, and they're writing things down, but they have to figure out what they're going to say. And if they can say a thing in a smooth way that when they talk, they realize they don't sound crazy, then usually their papers are better. Because you can kind of bluff your way through writing, but you can't bluff your way through talking. You either know it or you don't. I mean, you can, but everyone knows, more so than when you're just writing it for your teacher. So if you can, hold on for a second, Falcon, I need you to stop, please, thanks. So if you can have your student talk through it, explain the what and the how and the why, then you already are on your way for content. So that means when you are grading it, all right, if you know the content of the book, then when you are reading through it, and structure is going to help you, which is what we're getting to next. If you've already had these discussions, you've read the book, you've had these discussions, as you're reading it, you're going to be able to see that there are very clear lines. You know, your student clearly knows what a paragraph is about, the content is true, and the analysis of it at least makes sense. And you become less frustrated with something when you're familiar with the reading too. And go read SparkNotes. Like, read the book and then go read SparkNotes yourself. I really try to do your best to keep your teen away from SparkNotes or Schmoop or any of that at first. And try to get them to talk it through with you. Because regurgitating SparkNotes can be useful in that at least they understand it, but it's not going to be useful for them later, like if they go watch a movie and they're trying to analyze the worldview of that movie, or if they read a new book and then they have to be able to talk about it and no one has written about it. If they don't have those tools, then it's going to be frustrating for everyone. So for the content, again, you're looking for, when you're grading, what's happening and why and how it's happening. And then some tips for doing that is you read the book too, and then have discussions and ask those questions. Who is doing it? Why is it being done? How does it reflect the author's larger theme? And more than likely, if you're choosing the books, or even if your student is choosing the books, you already, you know what's going on, probably, or you're going to be more, depending on how you choose books, you're going to at least know the basics of the stories, probably, going in. So, and I mean, always, start off with something they know. If they love Harry Potter and you love Harry Potter and you're cool with that, talk through it. What is the author trying to say about goodness? What is the author trying to say about friendship? And what characters show this? What is the author saying about sacrifice? And how does the plot show that the author is pro sacrificing yourself or against it? If you can start off with something that they know and then move into something that's less familiar, and they just ask the same questions, they're going to feel more confident, but you're going to feel more confident when you get to the actual paper. All right, so number one is you need to know what's the content, what content you want. You can also, again, with the content, if you're making up the prompts, it's going to make your life easier, because you're going to be able to guide the student and saying, all right, the content I'm most comfortable with is going to be character and theme. So I want you to write a paper over this book, over the characters and how they show the theme. Or you can come up with it together. And that's going to help you grade the paper more, because you're already looking at something that interests both of you, or at least you. All right, so number two is looking at the structure. Now, I tend still to do the very traditional, when I'm teaching, the traditional either 3 paragraphs or 5 paragraph, and then as they get into seniors, 8 to 10 paragraphs. Here is why. One, creative writing and academic writing are different. They're different beasts. You should be able to influence. Your creative writing should reflect some of the best of academic writing, the structure, but your academic writing should reflect some of the very good things of creative writing. Creative writing, though, is it's not formal, and you're expected to have these imaginatives. You're expected to have fragments. You're expected to have these. You might have super run-on sentences, and that's the point. But when you're looking at a formal essay, still, even in a very unstructured age, there's still the expectation of structure. And if you can teach them several ways to have a structure and then expand on it, it's going to make their lives easier. If they are struggling writers, that structure gives them exactly what to do and makes them feel less uncomfortable. So high structure equals low anxiety a lot of times, right? Low structure often means high anxiety. It depends on the way you run your house and the way you run a classroom. That tends to be the case. There are students who don't want any structure, but they're creating their own structure, which tends to be, they still structure it. They're just doing it themselves. So when we're looking at these, I keep that traditional structure with the expectation of, let's see your writing, let's see your style come through. And if a student who's an excellent writer breaks the structure, but still maintains really great writing and flow, I keep it. I don't dock people for good writing. But if I have an amazing writer who decides to not keep the structure and it goes everywhere, the first thing I do is say, go back to the structure that you know, because it's going to help you. And then if I have struggling writers, I can say, all right, you need sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3, 4, and 5. You have written your paragraph. Do that again for your next topic. And that usually helps them to feel confident, and it will help you as you're grading, unless you're already a writer. Like if you are a strong writer, you're probably not going to be here. But if you are a writer, so when we're looking at structure, I look at the body paragraphs first. And let me draw this out. I know y'all have probably seen this a million times. So with a traditional 5-paragraph essay, you've got that whole funnel thing going on, right? And there are certain things that I'm not super particular about, right? But you have your intro, body paragraphs, conclusion, thesis here, all that. So what I tend to do is and I still do this, because when I have 80 papers to grade, structure is one of the things that actually makes it so that I can just like plow through the grading, because I'll have a rubric. The rubric has the structure. It's one of the things I'll share with you, and it works. So nope. Everybody said no. So when we're looking at this, what I mean structure is the idea of having the topic. It's just your basic paragraphs, right? It's having your topic sentence and your topic sentence clearly tying into your content, right? So you're going to have your topic sentence. You're going to have a basic summary. I'm writing this down, sorry. And I'll give you there's samples, like there's so many ways of doing this, but this is kind of the basics, all right? So you're gonna have like a topic sentence, some sort of summary to give us context. So this is, again, you're not avoiding summary, you're just not majoring on summary. An analysis, so this is how this summary ties in with this topic sentence. An explanation, so you're going deeper into your analysis really, and then a conclusion sentence. Now right there, that's what, 5 sentences? If you follow this structure for each of these body paragraphs, with sentence variety, which we'll get into with grammar. But looking at that, you have right there the meat of your paragraph and the meat of what you're looking for to grade. Again, part of the fear, the grading fear, is the fact that you struggle probably with teaching it. So if you have this structure and you're like, all right, in some way, shape, or form, this is what I want in a smooth flow in each of your body paragraphs, then you can already say, all right, you're missing your analysis. I can't grade this until you actually put in some analysis. But if you're just reading it and you're like, something feels off, but I don't quite know what it is, and then you get to the end and you realize that there was no real connection to the thesis, if you don't have something like this guiding you and you're not used to doing this, then this, you might just have a bunch of summary with a conclusion that kind of touches on like your thesis, but not really, but kind of does. And you're like, well, I don't know if this works or not, but I'm going to keep it. If you have something like this for each paragraph, then it's easier for you to grade, but it's also easier for you to explain to the student, like, here's what you're missing. And I also include integrated quotes. So every body paragraph has to have evidence from the text, and the evidence has to be a direct quote. And it has to be fully part of another sentence. It can't just be random sentences like thrown in. It has to be clearly part of a fuller sentence, like integrated quotes. So this analysis part tends to be, the summary and the analysis tends to be where that lay is, and the explanation is just expanding on that idea. So again, that's a little deeper, and I'll have that in the notes that I send you. All right, so that's part of looking at the structure. And then with your conclusion and intro, all right, so again, being super, 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 super traditional, if you hate this, and also this is literary writing, this is not history writing. History writing is a different beast. They do things differently, drives me crazy. I respect it, I don't enjoy it. So you have a thesis at the end and a restatement at the beginning. And the biggest thing, and I think that the real writing comes in, where the freedom comes in, and where if you want to be more creative, that these things come in with your introduction and your conclusion. Because as you saw, traditional structure, you start off broad, you narrow down to your thesis. But you have to know where you're going. You have to know your thesis. And again, that goes back to content. And you have to be able to work your way from a broad statement, step by step, down to your thesis in a way that is enjoyable and makes sense. You have to take people on a really small journey on your introduction. And the goal of that journey is your thesis. So each step in that journey, 4 or 5 sentences, is to feel as if you've arrived at that thesis organically. Now, when you're grading, the main thing is you want to make sure there's a clear thesis, and that the introduction, that it doesn't just tell you what the paper is about. And that tends to be what historical essays do. They're like, we're going to tell you what this is about. They tell you very briefly, like 3 sentences, what the rest of the paper will be about, and then there'll be a thesis. Tends to broaden on that and then restate it again in the conclusion. With a literary analysis paper, that's not what you want. You want something broad that narrows to a thesis. And that broad part, and this is what you'll be looking for as you grade, that broad part can be any relevant historical background information. So if you've got someone who's just like, I love history and I got to talk about it, this is where that happens. It can be historical context. It can be the author. If there's something like with Dickens, right? Like, you can't separate the man's life from his writings, or his time. So if you were doing something about character development and the old Curiosity Shop, and if you were doing that, you could clearly bring in background information about Charles Dickens that you don't want in the rest of the paper. when you're talking character development, you just want to focus on the book. You don't want to bring the author into it. But you might need that in your introduction to lead down into it. And having that in the introduction is going to keep the rest of that paper tight, because they're not like, oh my gosh, and I gotta talk about Dickens here. No, you will talk about him in your introduction leading to your thesis. You can, so again, historical context, author information that's pertinent, not just random author stuff. And also, you can talk about, and you could do all three of these, like that's mostly choice. You can talk about things that happen in the book that will make your thesis make more sense and maintain the focus of the paper. If you have a student who just wants to verbal vomit, your goal is going to end up being to keep them focused. That's what the thesis should do. But if they're the kind that still have, their brain is still like working through structural stuff, right? And they're like, I gotta say all this stuff because if I don't say it, then none of this makes sense. You're like, okay, that goes in the introduction. So when you're grading the paper and you're like, all right, we're talking about the life of Dickens, unless your thesis is Dickens' life is clearly reflected in his characters. But if you're only talking about the book and not looking at the author, you can say, all right, talk about the author up here and then lead to your thesis and then leave him out of the rest. So that means when you're grading the final draft, rough draft, that's just going to be cleaning stuff up and getting them to restructure. Like that only matters, like for me, the only reason I grade rough drafts is because I have to say that somebody did something. But for you, it just needs to be done at a certain time with some attempt at structure so that you can help them restructure. And if you give them the structure that I'm going to send you and see how it works for them, that's already done. But the attempt at structure. So that's going to help you when you're looking at structure. You look at the body paragraphs, the different points that you would need. You look at the intro paragraph. What kind of background does it clearly lead to a clear thesis? And then you can come down to your conclusion, which is where most people struggle. And they usually just want to rehash what they said because the conclusion is difficult. The conclusion tends to be where you can draw your moral lessons. Try to be formal, try not to be too, it's good to be moral, right? But try not to be too preachy and turn into second person and you should do this. And as you can see, you know, bad people. You don't want to do it that much, but you want to expand maybe on the author's conclusion. This is mine. And if y'all take the my online class that I'm doing, I teach the Masque of the Red Death, and that's when we really get into this. So in the Masque of the Red Death, this prince is trying to escape a plague and cannot, and in the end everyone dies from this plague that they have actually locked themselves into a castle to avoid, but death still comes to them. And one of the biggest conclusions that I tend to want my students to take from this is that this is a prince who has locked himself away. A prince's goal in life should be the protection of his people. It makes sense to quarantine yourself. It doesn't make sense to neglect all of your people as a good prince, quarantine yourself and have a huge party and in this attempt to escape death. He's being a bad prince. And he doesn't matter, he still dies. And he's helped nobody but himself. So one of the things that a lot of students like to do in their conclusion is they'll talk about that this reflects, you know, modern life where people do drugs, go to parties, and they do it in this attempt to escape death and to avoid helping others because it's harder to help others. It's easier to try to escape. And that one of the big takeaways is that people should try to help others. Also, you can't escape that. So that is what you're looking for in a conclusion. You know, and it can be more. You can also just kind of talk about how the more about the historical context, more about the author, but expand on it to make it a little more universal. And that's why conclusions are hard. And they can be hard to grade because you have to give suggestions on improvement. So the thing you're looking at when you look at conclusions is it merely repeating the paper? Or is it too short? Usually it's too short. Usually it's like 2 sentences long and they're like, I'm so done. So I always have them write the body paragraph first, then go in and write the first part, the intro, and then when they're finished, like the next day, write the conclusion. That way they're not just burnt out on paper writing. They always have their thesis first, like that's always there as the guiding principle. So again, when you're looking at the structure part of grading, that's what you're looking at. Funnel, so broad ideas leading to a narrow thesis. And the thesis should be 1 sentence. Then a topic sentence with 4 supporting analysis sentences. So 3 of those. And then your conclusion with a restatement of your thesis and expanding into something universal. So not repeating the paragraphs, not repeating the main ideas. It will in the thesis restatement, but that's it. You're done then. All right, so when you're looking at it, you've got content. So again, not just summary. It has to be analysis. Structure, which I just gave you, and finally grammar. I tend to clean up the grammar now again, this is when I'm grading. And I have to, again, it's required by law. And it's, it's necessary to get most people motivated. Ideally, grammar would come in a second rough draft, and then everything would be cleaned up in your final draft. I tend to not have time to do that. But in an ideal world, you'd have about three drafts. The first really focused on content and structure. The second really focused on grammar. And then the final. The reason the second is focused on grammar is this. If the structure and content is really awful, and it tends to be at first, you want to make sure that it's going to change. So it doesn't matter if you grade the grammar, because everything's going to be different if they did a really bad job on the structure and content. So you wait till that second rough draft to go in and just really hammer on grammar. And these are the things that I specifically look for. 1, it's formal. So that means no first or second person. Number 2, you want to make sure, well, it's formal. So that's no contractions, no first or second person, no slang, no text speak, no emojis, none of that. Then, number 2, you want to avoid the 5 serious errors. So that's no run-ons, no comma splices, no fragments, no subject-verb disagreement, and no pronoun-antecedent disagreement. I tend to have students, instead of doing the everyone should do what he said, I tend to just say use plural pronouns because there's no confusion. And that's the tendency. Usually they do a single plural mix. If you just stick with plurals, then unless it's specifically a male or female, but usually it's not, just stick with plurals and it kind of cleans up the grammar. Then, and these are all grammar basics. So these are things that your student and you should be very familiar with, right? So knowing because I know it starts in first grade, right? We're homeschooling, and the first grade book has all of these things in it. So that should be something that y'all are pretty familiar with. If you have been to a poorly done public school and you're pulling a student out, then definitely there's so many things online now, like games and videos and things, and I can put some of those in that you can just use. I use for refreshers. I use them for me. I use them for my students. I use them for my kid. Because if you aren't using it regularly, like over the summer, I forget stuff if I'm not writing all the time. So definitely refresh those and do it at the beginning of the year. Like if you're not homeschooling year round, like if you do take the summer off and they're not doing a lot of writing, start off with a refresher. You should do that every year as a human if you're going to write anything. And so be familiar with those, the formal essay, and then be familiar with the 5 serious errors and avoiding them. Then, because you don't want to just stop with bad writing or, avoid bad writing, you want to promote good. That's when you start looking at sentence variety sentence variety, really working on having strong, interesting nouns and verbs. And, those are really the big things. Sentence variety and strong nouns, verbs. If you can add some, like, I've had students who are really great with visuals. So even within their analysis, they'll do comparisons, similes, metaphors, and that sort of thing. They'll spice it up with some tropes. Then go for that. If they're not good at that, just stick with the basics of good writing, strong verbs, active voice, and sentence variety, and you'll be fine. And you can grade it that way. Now, I don't ever go, I don't know IEW that well. I'm not a fan of adverbs. I think you should have really, really strong verbs. See, really, really powerful verbs. And I'm not sure about, as they get older, the necessity of a checklist, because as they read more and they read really great writing, oh, Debbie, phones. Yeah, it went a little longer than I expected. But as they're reading, their writing will get better. So the checklists are, that's useful when you're first starting out. But as you get into this, that's just one more thing. And if your checklist makes your writing clunky, then throw out the checklist. But if your writing's not clunky and you just need a little help, it's always good to go back and look and say, hey, I could, use a better noun, use a better verb, be active, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't recommend having checklists as they get older, unless writing is, unless they're not doing it. Like if you have to get them to do something by providing that checklist, that's what rubrics are for. But mostly, they should listen to, read it back to themselves and see if it sounds good. And if it sounds good, go forward. So those are some of the ways that you can. Good. I'm glad it's helpful. Do you have any questions? Because a lot of times it's just a matter of doing it so many times until you're so done. But if you break it down into those 3 things where you look at content, structure, and grammar, that's what they're doing when they write it. So if you're doing it when you grade it, and if you did 4 drafts, which would be even better, where the first one is about the content, the second one is about the structure, the third one is the grammar, and then the fourth one is how, when you go through and just clean it all up, it gives them the structure to hang the rest of their essays on. And they're like, oh, I need to know what my content's going to be, because you can do this with a history essay, right? What's my content? And if it's just straight up telling about a battle or whatever, doing that. And then if it's analyzing a battle, like this is they had great tactics. The Boston Tea Party was a great idea. Like if you're doing it as an analysis, then you can kind of stick that same literature structure on there, because then you're analyzing an event, and a work of literature is an event, right? It's a written event. So with multiple events going on. So you could even structure history paper that way and grade it that way. And I think it makes it easier, and it makes preparing rubrics easier. And the more you can break it down for them and make it less stressful each grading time, the better, the less they're going to hate the writing part. And the less you're going to hate the writing part, honestly. So I think that's it. I mean, there's always a million other things, but this is how I teach. When I teach my students, this is where I teach this everywhere. So at Next, where I'm teaching. This is how I teach analysis. When I taught at Spartanburg Community, Greenville Tech, that's how I taught it. I taught in the magnet school, taught it when I taught the homeschool co-ops. The online class, this is how I'm doing it. So it's pretty consistent. You might have other people who are like, this is the worst idea and we hate 5-paragraph essays. But if you can fit your ideas into a structure that's clear, then you can always expand. But if you can't even do that, then you can't expand and be creative with it. You can do an interpretive dance with it, but not necessarily put your ideas out there. You should do beyond 5-paragraph essays, but we're not doing that in 9th grade. I'm not anyway. All right, so if you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and end this, but you can always message me with more questions. And if you have, once I get all this, it's probably going to go out tomorrow because I'm going to have to download the video and upload it to YouTube, and that takes hours at times. So I'm going to go ahead and jump off, but just to let you know, the literature general lit semester does happen or start on the 21st. I'll take people until then, and we're going to be focused on arts integration, but we'll include literature, grammar, vocabulary, writing. We'll do a lot of writing. We'll do some public speaking actually, and I will be offering, at least for the really big paper, the Mask of the Red Death paper, I will actually offer rough draft conferences. So they're going to be about 15 minutes, and I'll schedule those in, and parents are welcome to join and see and hear how I grade and go over the work. It's real quick. Like I'm like, all right, you need to do this, you need to do this. Here's what you did. What were you thinking here? Okay, this needs to change. We're golden. Doesn't need to be like, it's gonna be short, but we'll work it out so that all the students can get that conference time in, probably for 2 essays. So feel free to join, and I will talk to y'all later. Bye.